Go ahead and bring up the title slide, and I understand from out front and even here on the drum set. And by the way, now this doesn't count as part of the sermon, okay? But let's give the Lord a great round of applause for the wonderful work the music team did today. My goodness. If you could hear me sing, you would understand why the Lord gave me the gift of preaching and not singing. But in such beautiful harmony, I just love that. And harmony is a picture of the church, isn't it? People doing different things, different ways, but it comes together for a wonderful. And so thank you all for leading us in worship in that way. I was certainly blessed by it. The book, Tender Warrior, I was assigned chapter 4. I think Jeff was afraid I couldn't think of anything to say today, maybe. But it was a wonderful read. I did read the chapter, and I gleaned some things from it that I want to share with you. But most importantly, what this man shares with us is biblically based. He begins and ends and continues with the scripture, and as you'll see in just a moment, uses the example of Job. But notice, every man's purpose, every woman's dream, and every child's hope. And I hope that I'm supposing you have the book distributed or available to distribute, so I would encourage you. It's a good read. And we're on chapter 4, which talks about staying power. I said this a little earlier, but let me do it. Go ahead and do it. When I was at Asbury Seminary, one of our most effective professors was Darrell Whiteman, who was a cultural anthropologist from a Christian point of view. And he said, this is like in the early 90s, before some of you were born. He said, these problems we're having with sexual identity, drug abuse, alcoholism, et cetera, they aren't the problems of our society. They are symptoms of a much greater problem, and that is the breakdown of the nuclear family unit, and more specifically, a Christian family unit. And if you think of God's creation story and the story of the church and so forth, that men are expected to be leaders in the family. Not the dominator, not the boss, but spiritual leaders in the family. And that is so missing. So no wonder you see on the news a young man is shot by police or whatever. He's never been taught from a loving, firm way how to receive instructions. He's never seen it modeled in front of him. And so therefore all he knows to do is to do one of two things, to run or to fight. And it all ends in tragedy. So I think today, as we can think of men who have staying power and what the source of that staying power, think of what it would do for that person, that man. Think of what it would do for their family, and think of what it would do for our society to have family units led by godly men that have staying power. Staying power. And that's where we want to go today. And no better example could you find than Job. I preached here a couple of years ago and used Job, and we used the part of where, he had gone through all of these things and shared that with you. But today we want to read from the very first part. I'm going to look up here because that writing is larger than that writing back there, and you're going to be focused on that anyway. So I'm not neglecting you. I'm just reading the same thing you're reading. See what we can glean from the life of Job. It said, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. Now, Job is doing all right, isn't he, up to this point? Oh, that could be our goal. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. So therefore, it was not boring around his house, right? He possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen. That would be 1,000 oxen, and 500 female donkeys, and very many servants. Had a lot of employees, you could say. so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. His sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one in his day, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. So apparently they were a happy family. They were a celebrating family. They were a together family. This next verse may tell us why. And when the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did, how? Continually. Not just when a crisis came, not just when they were going to the party, not just on the holiday, but Job did this continually, beginning early in the morning. And so therefore you can see much of the key of why Job was the man that Job was. Now let's go to some observations that I found in reading this chapter, some things I gleaned from it, and possibly as you read it, and if you read it, you'll see some other things. But these are some things that I would really like for you to point out. And I know we have this on live feed, and you can always look it up on your computer or whatever. Maybe go back and study these if you don't have time right now to read the entire chapter. But here's some observations that I found, and these are biblical observations. I want to emphasize that over and over again. It's wonderful that this man has some training and some psychological ability and some communicating ability and so forth, but it's biblically based what he's sharing with us. Number one, Job carried his family in his heart. His family was important to them. In his very being was his family. And Job was God's servant. He did what he did serving the Lord. I met one of your members at O'Shea's. I snuck off down to O'Shea's thinking I want to get something good to eat, and nobody knows me here, and so nobody can go and tell my doctor that I strayed from my diet. And here comes this wonderful waitress named Mia, who in the course of conversation says, "Oh, I live in Oldham County. I was just about ready to recommend the Phos Church," she said, and we worship at Phos Church. And in spite of all that, she was here today. She was here today in the early service. So there are all kinds of ways to be God's servant in the job you do. The way you do your job can be serving the Lord. And apparently we see that in Job. Job was God's servant in the marketplace, in the family, in the business world. Catastrophes can take things away. They can never take what's inside. You know, if you read just a little further in Job, Satan tempted him, tested him, took everything he had away. But the joy of the Lord was still in Job. Mike said in the earlier service, even though he crushed his toe, he still had the joy of the Lord. Mike, one question I failed to ask you. When did you first notice that rock had fallen on your toe? Okay. After he woke up. Okay. You can give away the wonderful things that the Lord has put in your heart, but bad times cannot take those away. Job was not happy about losing everything, but he still could have the joy and the peace and the confidence of the Lord. Those are the kind of men we need today. Okay, Job's masculinity and his personal identity were found in God. The greatest question among human beings, and I've seen them and talked to them all around the world, is, who am I? Why am I here? What's my purpose in life? Do I really matter? His masculinity, his very identity was found in the Lord. And let's remember that. Okay? Men who don't know God's idea of manhood cut and run. Men who haven't realized and experienced what it really means to be a man. A godly man, not just a male human being, but a man, usually many a times cut and run when times get hard. I'll give you an example right here. Now, when I say this, I'm not saying this in any criticism, and certainly in no judgmental way. But look at this statistic here. Since 1920, divorce rate has increased 1,420%. That's, you might say, in a century. In less than a century, 1,420%. And usually in these breakups, who is it that leaves? Who is it that usually leaves? More than not, the men leave. Now, as I said, I'm not criticizing. I'm not judgmental. There's probably not a family here that has not directly experienced divorce in your family. I know it's certainly the case at least twice in my immediate family, and I know what it does, and I'm troubled by this, and I think where we're going today will help us to remedy that somewhat. Ours is the first generation where separation and divorce are considered a normal part of family life because we live in a hope-so world. We're going to have this nice, the man meets a beautiful, lovely lady. They marry. Things don't go well. He cuts and runs. He hoped it would work, but it just didn't work out. And $200 and you're out of there. It's so easy. And remember, men who don't know what it really means to be a man, in God's definition, it's very easy for them to cut and to run. We live in a hope-so world. And here's a good one. Promise making and promise, read that with me. Promise making and keeping are at the heart of godliness. We're going to read in just a little bit. Let's go to the next slide where God said, I will never leave you. That's a promise, and I'll never forsake you. And he didn't, did he? He hasn't yet. Okay, here's some more. Roots are critical to growing things, and families are built with staying power. We live in a very mobile society. I asked the earlier group, how many of you live in the very same community you were born and raised in? Okay, you're still living there. Okay, you're in the minority because we're in a very mobile society. When I worked down at E-Town for a little while, we had a retired sergeant major there living in Radcliffe. And he said the way they dealt with that in their family was, because they'd moved like 20 times in his military career, that we taught our children that where our family is where our home is. Our home is where our family happens to be. So you can see how that core of a family unit worked for them and raised a wonderful family, and they stayed together. Job's staying power was rooted in his walk with the Lord. That's a little bit repetitive, but I think that's pretty obvious. And then in the chapter, he gave an example of a pastor named Orville, Pastor Orville, who had staying power. And he was talking about a church that he had served. I mean, it was one of those tough churches. He said that church was so mean, they deserved King Herod as their pastor, not Pastor Orville. And he said, along about that time, I was beginning to feel the call to ministry, but because what I'd seen him go through, I didn't want to be manhandled by people. And he shared that thought. Pastor Orville, God is calling me to be a minister, but I don't want to be manhandled by these people. And I can just see Pastor Orville kind of dropping his head and said, well, really, that may be what we're called to do. Now think with me of the human being, the God-man, Jesus Christ, who lived on this earth, was probably manhandled more and more cruelly than any person that's ever walked the face of this earth. But yet the Lord had what? He had staying power. He could have called, 10 legions of angels? He had staying power, and he models that for us. And so he said, Pastor Orville never left the bride of Christ, because that's what he was called to do. And he modeled humility. He modeled staying power. And no doubt people were helped by it. Okay, let me find my place up there. The Lord help me remember that nothing is going to happen to me today that you and I can't handle together. That word together being very important. The heart of staying power is sacrifice, giving yourself up for the good of another. Men, The family is worth it. That wife is worth it. Those children are worth it. And by the way, society is worth you having staying power. And there again, who modeled sacrifice more than anyone else that's ever walked the face of this earth? The Lord modeled what staying power and sacrifice will do. The ultimate example, of course, is Christ. And Jesus not only modeled staying power, but he provides it for the asking and rolls up his sleeves. I love that image. He rolls up his sleeves and goes to work and helps us have staying power as men in our families, as men in this church, and as men in society. Now let's go to the next slide. Now those are just some observations that I made from reading the chapter. I want to encourage you to do the same. What is that? Well, if you need to go put your windows up, I'll understand. You wouldn't be the first person that walked out on some of my preaching. Okay. Now, here's some visual. They say a picture's worth 1,000 words, and I've already spoken 1,000 words. So look at this. I love this picture, a picture of a Christian night. At the Scottish Rite Center down in Louisville, they had the celebration of the battle. I can't remember the battle's name, but the battle where Scotland defeated England for their independence. They can't exactly document this, but they think that one of the reasons that gave them just enough to win that battle was the fact that they had several of these Christian knights, godly Christian men that were willing to fight for a cause, and that helped to sway the battle their way. But I look at this picture. This is the kind of men I think that we're looking for, that God is looking for, that this book is looking for, that I think you want to be. And ladies, especially young ladies, certainly the kind of man that you ought to be looking for. Someone who it simultaneously is praying for peace, but at the same time is prepared for war. And that's really loud when it rains here, isn't it? I can be like old Brother Mask on the radio. I can get louder if I need to. Okay. Praying for peace, but yet prepared to go to war for something, for my family, to prepare to fight for what's right, prepared to be a man. And you can have that balance, and we're going to show you how and why. You've seen many pictures of knights. I love this. But have you seen pictures of them when the king or whoever it is lays the sword on the shoulder? What position is the knight usually in? The knight is usually doing what? Not standing real proud, but what is he doing? He is down on his knees, maybe both knees. And will you come help me up in just a minute? Okay. But see that humility? I'm praying. I'm humble. I'm praying for peace, but yet I'm prepared for war. With God's help, we can be that kind of man. Okay, let's go to the next one. And here are some qualities that make that possible. This reminds us of St. Patrick. What do we remember St. Patrick for? Other than drinking green beer, what do you remember St. Patrick for? He drove the snakes out of Ireland. I saw this funny video on Facebook this last St. Patrick's Day. Here was St. Patrick's driving a car down the road, and the back seat was full of snakes. And one was saying, how much further do we have to go? Are we there yet? What will we do when we get there? And he had this beleaguered look on his face. This is what made St. Patrick worth remembering. And this is what will give you staying power. Christ, read that with me. Christ beside me. Christ before me. Christ behind me. Christ within me. Christ beneath me. Christ above me. But look right in the center. Christ within me. Remember the quote, nothing can happen, Lord, that you and I can't handle together. And if Christ is in here, that's our nature. And Christ, by the way, had staying power. He had staying power. I realize this is mostly for the men today, but let me challenge you women to help your man be someone that has staying power. Let me encourage you young men that are here today, let it be your goal to be that kind of. You Semper Fi guys know what you're going to find out here pretty soon. By the way, if someone hasn't told you what it means to have staying power, and don't we appreciate their service that they're willing to do for our country. They're going to learn staying power. And what do they say? Once a Marine, always a Marine. Staying power. Staying power. We appreciate that. With these qualities in your life, you can have that. And then I would like to challenge the young women here today. Look for that kind of man. If you feel led to fall in love and to marry, look for that kind of man. Carl and I went to a wedding over in Shelby County earlier. Well, it was in June, I believe. Outside wedding. Have y'all ever realized how hot it can be at an outside wedding with your back turned to the sun? But it was a beautiful wedding. And that young lady, at an earlier age, several years ago, had made a list of the kind of man, the only kind of man that she would settle for. I'm talking about it was a list. And the pastor read it at the wedding. He got down to about point number 10, and he wasn't through. And so he looked at her and he said, well, how's he doing so far? And he'd read a little further. How's he doing so? It was a long, godly list. Ladies, look for that kind of man. You'll never, never, never regret it. Let's go to the next one. St. Patrick had those qualities. To me, I love this picture. I love hands. Those remind me many times of my dad's hands. Look at that and see, what does that remind you of? What do you see there? And I think that can sort of encapsulate what we're trying to say here today. God needs, you need, this church needs, society needs that picture there. Those are large hands. They look like working hands, don't they? They look like dirty hands. I'd say there's some calluses on there. But look inside that beautiful little hand, little chubby hand. Aren't those dimples cute on that child's hand? I just love little chubby babies' hands. Reminds me of my granddaughters. If y'all want to hear about them, I can talk to you quite a while about that. And perhaps that child is sitting in the man's lap. Perhaps he's telling them a story. But more importantly, perhaps he's been living a story in front of that child. And he's tough, and he knows how to work, and he's strong. He doesn't mind getting his hands dirty. Are there any gardeners here today? Any gardeners? Want-to-be gardeners? What do they say? If you're a good gardener, you have a what? Okay. But what is a green thumb really involve? Dirt under the fingernails, because you've been in there working and doing what is necessary to help those garden plants be. I see that picture there. And so what I want to leave with you today is the thought that men, you can have staying power. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me to steal my joy, to steal my staying power? Let's go further now. Philippians 4:13. I wear it right here. I can do all things through him, or through Christ who strengthens me. Not 90%. I can do what? I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. All right, next. And back to Job. Good old Job. And I sent this, and I should have sent a couple of more verses. You'd be surprised how good $1 pair of glasses will help you see. Job said after he'd gone through this, but he knows the way, speaking of God, he knows the way that I take. When he has tried me, I shall come out as gold. And then verse 11, my feet have followed in his tracks. I have kept in his way and not turned aside. I have not departed from the commands of his lips. Now listen to this. I have treasured the words of his mouth more than my daily food. Job depended on God. Job walked with God. He served God. So therefore, he was able to have staying power. And let that be our model. And now I think we have one more. Remember, what's at stake? Your manhood, your family, and even society. Would anyone agree with me? Am I the only one who thinks that society could use some help? We're in bad shape. We need help. And men, you can help solve that problem. Real men don't run, and God will help you get it done. Or as Larry the Cable Guy would say, get her done. Okay. With God's help, you can do that. Be a man with staying power. Women, help your men have staying power. Young men, let that be your goal with God's help, to have staying power. Young women, don't settle for anyone else. Don't settle for anything less than a man that has godly staying power. Let's bow together as the worship team comes. Lord, help us to realize how miserably we always fail when we try to do it on our own. And when we try on our own, we usually cut and run. But I pray, Lord, that you would inspire these wonderful men, these young men here today, to be men who have staying power with your help. And in the end, they'll be helped. They'll be a help to others, and you'll be glorified in what you've accomplished through them, for their own good, for their family's good, and for the good of our society that needs your help so bad. Lord, may it be according to your will. For I pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.